The morning they laughed at me, the temperature was already 91 degrees by 8 o'clock, and the locusts weren't here yet. I remember the exact date, July 14th, 2021, a Wednesday. I remember because my grandfather had died 11 days earlier, and I had spent those 11 days eating cold soup from the same pot, sleeping in his chair, and reading every document his lawyer had handed me in a rubber-banded stack that smelled like a church basement. I hadn't showered. I was wearing his barn coat over a tank top, which I realize now probably didn't help my case. The man at Delaware County Agricultural Credit Union, I'd seen him before, at the co-op, at the diner on Route 9, had the particular expression of someone who has already decided something and is now just waiting for you to finish. Talking, he was maybe 60, soft hands, a photograph behind him of himself holding a walleye on a lake somewhere. I told him I needed to refinance the operating line, $42,000. The farm was 118 acres in the hill country of upstate New York, about 14 miles east of a town called Briar Falls that had a gas station, a feed store, a diner, and a post office that closed at noon on Fridays. My grandfather had run it alone since my grandmother died in 2009. Now I was running it. I was 19 years old. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses. He didn't look at the papers I'd laid on his desk, the soil assessments, the production records, the tax filings from the last 6 years that I had organized into a manila folder with tabs, because I had learned early that when you are a girl who is 19 and you want someone to take you seriously, you bring tabs, he said. That's a lot of land for one person. I said I had some help. He asked what kind of help. I said, geese, mostly. And that is when he laughed. Not a surprised laugh, a settling back in the chair laugh, the kind that fills a room slowly and doesn't apologize for itself. And I heard it through the glass partition from the woman at the teller window, who caught herself and looked away, and from a man in a feed cap who was waiting behind me and did not bother to look away. 91 geese. That was what I had. 91 Toulouse Cross geese that my grandfather had purchased the previous October from a breeder in Schoharie County for reasons he had not fully explained to anyone, including, as far as I could tell, himself. They were enormous, gray-bodied, slow-moving, and completely silent. Not one of them had ever made a sound in the 8 months since they'd arrived. Everyone in Delaware County knew about my grandfather's mute geese. Everyone thought it was the eccentricity of an old man losing his grip. None of them had read his notebook yet. The notebook was in the barn, not the house. That was the first thing that told me it mattered to him. The things my grandfather kept in the house were things he was done with. Framed photographs, tax records, the Bible with the ribbon marker that hadn't moved in 30 years. The things he kept in the barn were the things he was still working on. I'd found it the first week of March, tucked into the gap between 2 boards in the feed room, behind the grain scoop. A composition book, the black and white marbled kind, held shut with a rubber band that had long since welded itself to the cover. I had to peel it off in pieces. The first page said, in his handwriting, small, left-leaning, the letters of a man who'd been left-handed and trained out of it in school. Locust Notes 2019. The dash had nothing after it. He'd left the end date open. I want to explain what kind of man my grandfather was, because it matters for understanding why no one believed me when I showed up at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in October with a folder of tabs and a plan built on a dead man's research. He was not a romantic about farming. He had no patience for sentiment. He pulled calves in the cold at 2 in the morning and didn't talk about it. He drove a 1998 GMC Sierra that he'd bought used and maintained himself and would not replace until it fell apart, which it had not done yet. When the county extension office sent a man out to suggest he rotate his cover crops differently, my grandfather listened for 12 minutes, thanked him, and went back to doing it the same way he'd been doing it for 40 years. He was not wrong, as it happened. The extension man had been working from a soil profile 2 counties east. The point is, he did not buy 91 geese because he liked birds. He did not buy them because he was sentimental, or confused, or losing his grip, as people had started to say by the time he died in February. He bought them because of what he'd found in the 1953 ledger that his father had kept, the one stored in the root cellar in a waxed canvas sleeve, the one I didn't know existed until I read the composition book. I didn't understand the full logic of it yet on that October morning in the bank. I had pieces of it, enough to know that the silence of the geese was not a defect, enough to know that the acreage he'd kept unplanted along the eastern fence line was not waste, enough to know that what he'd been preparing for was something that arrived on a known schedule if you knew where to look. The banker had stopped laughing by then and was looking at my folder. I opened it to the first tab. The folder had 3 tabs. I'd put them together the night before at the kitchen table under the hanging bulb, with the composition book open beside me and the 1953 ledger open beside that, and a yellow legal pad where I'd been converting his shorthand into plain sentences for the better part of 2 weeks. The first tab was the soil map, not the county extension map. That was the one the banker already had in his own files, the one that showed our eastern strip as marginal, low yield, not worth the input cost. Mine was older. My grandfather had hand-traced it from the original survey plat filed with Harnett County in 1947, then annotated it in pencil over the following decades, updating the moisture readings each spring until his handwriting got too shaky to be legible, which was about 2019. The eastern strip wasn't marginal, it was a catch basin. In dry years it looked useless. In certain other years it was the most important 12 acres on the property. The banker looked at it for a moment. He had the expression of a man who's deciding whether to be interested. I let him look. I didn't explain it yet. The second tab was a table I'd made myself, pulled from 3 sources. My grandfather's ledger entries from 1953, 1965, 1978, and 1987, a USDA historical pest record I'd requested from the State Agricultural Library in Raleigh. It had taken 11 days to arrive, a photocopy, 43 pages, and a climate pattern summary from a university extension paper published in 2017 that my grandfather had printed out and paper clipped to the back of the composition book without comment. The table showed a cycle, not a perfect cycle, not a clock you could set, but a pressure system and drought combination that had recurred roughly every 11 to 14 years in our part of the Piedmont, and that had, 4 times in the recorded history of this farm, produced the same result, a grasshopper emergence so dense it stripped fields in under a week. The banker set down the soil map. He picked up the table. I watched his eyes move across it. I had kept the columns simple: year, conditions. What happened? What it cost farms that weren't prepared. What it cost my great-grandfather in 1953, which was almost everything. What it had cost him to learn it. What he had written in the ledger the following spring, which I had transcribed at the top of the page in a text box in his exact words. Next time we will be ready before it comes not after. The third tab was the feed and acquisition receipts for 91 geese, purchased over 6 weeks from 3 separate suppliers, with a 1-page summary of goose foraging behavior that I had printed from a university poultry extension bulletin. The banker put the table down slowly. He had not said anything in almost 4 minutes outside. The October light was going flat and gray against the window. He picked up the extension bulletin last. I had highlighted 3 paragraphs in yellow, the ones about foraging range, daily consumption rates, and the specific note about acridid grasshoppers, which the bulletin listed separately from common field grasshoppers because of their swarming, behavior, and the different timing of their hatch. He read slowly. I watched his thumb move across the page, the way my grandfather used to read, tracing the line. Then he set it down. 981 geese, he said. Yes, sir, that's a considerable number of geese. The extension bulletin recommends a minimum of 1 bird per acre for effective suppression coverage. I have 87 acres in active pasture and hay. I rounded up by 4 to account for losses. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, but measuring something. I had been measured that way before, by the feed store manager who asked twice whether my grandfather knew I was there, by the equipment dealer who kept directing his answers to the empty chair beside me. This was a different kind of measuring. He was deciding whether to revise something he had already decided. The loan request, he said. It's for operating expenses. Fencing reinforcement along the East Creek corridor, 2 replacement water lines, and 60 days of supplemental feed for the geese through the winter establishment period. The itemized breakdown is the last page of the 3rd tab. He turned to it. I had done the arithmetic 3 times before I printed it. Every line had a source, a supplier quote. A materials estimate from a contractor I had already spoken with, a per-pound feed cost from the co-op's published rate sheet. Nothing rounded, nothing approximate. Outside, a car passed on the county road. The fluorescent light above us buzzed once and held. He closed the folder. "Your grandfather," he said. "He banked with us for," he paused, reaching for it, 30-some years. 38 years, I said. He opened the account in March of 1985. I found the original paperwork in the filing cabinet in the office. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name, not pity. Something closer to recognition. "You've been running the operation since August," he said. "Since the 14th, he passed on the 9th. He nodded slowly and looked down at the folder again without opening it. I had the sense he was no longer reading it. He was thinking about something adjacent to it. Something the numbers had made real that hadn't been real before he walked into this room with a 19-year-old girl and a manila folder. He picked up his pen. "I'm going to need you to come back Thursday," he said. "There's a second signature required on anything over 8,000, and the other officer is out until then." I said that was fine. I meant it. I drove home on the county road with the heater running and the folder on the passenger seat, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 6 weeks, something that was close to forward motion. Thursday came with the kind of cold that felt personal. A hard freeze overnight had left the yard glassed over, and I had to chip the ice from the water troughs before I could even think about driving into town. The geese didn't mind. They moved across the frozen mud like a slow gray tide, their breath rising in small clouds, completely indifferent to the temperature. I had started noticing that about them, their absolute indifference to difficulty. No complaint, no hesitation, just the next thing. I left the farm at 8:30 and arrived at the bank 7 minutes early. The same waiting area, the same framed photographs of grain elevators and covered bridges, the same faint smell of carpet cleaner. But there was a second man this time. Older, with the kind of handshake that is more announcement than greeting. He sat across from me with the folder open, and read it the way people read documents when they're looking for a reason to pause. He found one on the 3rd page. "This equipment lien," he said, and tapped it twice with his index finger. "The baler. Still carrying 4,200 on it." I told him I knew. "That comes out of the operating account before we can finalize the credit line." I told him that was my understanding as well, and I had brought the payment in the form of a cashier's check made out to the finance company, which I set on the table without being asked. He picked it up and looked at it the way men sometimes look at things they expected to have to explain, but didn't. He set it back down. The first officer hadn't said much since I arrived. He was reviewing his own copy of the paperwork and made a small sound, not a word, just the exhalation of someone confirming something to themselves, and slid a signature line across to me. I signed where they asked, 3 places. I wrote my name exactly as it appeared in the original account documentation my grandfather had filed 38 years earlier, because I'd practiced it that way, matching the formality of the institution. When it was done, the older man stood and shook my hand again. Same announcement, but the frequency had changed slightly. Something in the grip. The first officer walked me to the door himself, which he hadn't done Tuesday. "The line will be active by end of business," he said. I thanked him and stepped outside into the cold. I sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. The credit line was $6,500. Not generous, but real. A number I could use against the world like a small, flat tool. What I hadn't told either of them, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was why I needed it by the end of October specifically. What I'd found in my grandfather's notebooks about this time of year, and what he'd written in the margin in a different ink, as though he'd gone back later to add it. Don't wait on this one. The notebook was a composition book, the old kind with marbled black and white covers. The cardboard gone soft at the corners from 38 years of a barn shelf. My grandfather had kept 3 of them, and I'd found them in the drawer beneath his seed ledgers the 2nd week of September, rubber banded together with a band that disintegrated when I touched it. 2 of the notebooks were what I'd expected. Planting records, soil amendments, equipment notes in his small, tight hand. The 3rd was different. It had no label on the cover. Inside, the entries weren't dated by calendar year. They were dated by season, by moon phase, by what he called pressure days. His own system, cross-referencing the almanac with whatever he'd observed over decades of watching this particular patch of ground. I'd read the whole third notebook in one sitting at the kitchen table, with the range going because October had come in cold. Most of it I understood in pieces. He wrote for himself, not for a reader, so some references looped back to things he never explained. But the passage in the different ink was clear. It was on the page marked late October, beneath a paragraph about moisture levels in the east field. The original entry discussed drainage, then, added later, the ink slightly darker, the handwriting the same but pressed harder, like he was writing it in a hurry or in poor light. He had written, "The year we lost the rye wasn't the frost. It was what came after the frost. They move when the ground stiffens. Don't wait on this one." That was all, no antecedent for they. No year given for the lost rye. I'd searched the other two notebooks for any entry about rye loss and found nothing, which meant either he'd recorded it somewhere I hadn't found yet, or he'd decided not to write it down, which, for a man who wrote down everything, including the exact date he'd replaced a belt on the baler, felt like its own kind of message. I'd driven to the county extension office the following week and asked the woman at the front desk about historical pest records for this part of the state. She'd looked at me with the particular patience people reserve for questions they consider slightly outside the normal range. She'd printed me 14 pages from a database and suggested I talk to someone at the university. I thanked her and took the pages home and read them at the table that same night. On page 9, there was a table of locust emergence events recorded in this county going back to 1941. They moved in cycles, not perfectly regular but clustered. The last recorded significant emergence was 39 years ago. The extension notes described it as a moderate event limited to the eastern agricultural corridor. Estimated crop impact 30 to 60% in unprotected fields. 39 years ago, I set the page down. I looked at the window outside. The first hard frost had come 2 nights before, right on schedule. 39 years. I kept coming back to that number. I wrote it in my notebook, circled it, drew a line from it to the year my grandfather had bought the Geese. The math landed where I expected it to land. I didn't sleep well that week, not because I was afraid, exactly. It was more like the feeling before an exam when you've studied enough to understand how much you don't know. I lay in the dark and listened to the geese out in the east paddock, the low sounds they made at night, not quite honking, more like the sound of water moving under ice. I'd stopped thinking of them as strange by then. 91 animals living 300 feet from my back door changes your sense of normal faster than you'd expect. I went back to the notebook. His handwriting in that final year was different from the earlier entries, more compressed, the letters leaning harder into the page, the way handwriting changes when someone is tired or in a hurry or writing against something they feel pressing. He'd started abbreviating words he'd always spelled out before. For field, N pasture, with no space. Geo, where he used to write the full name of his neighbor to the east. There was one entry I kept returning to. Late October, the year before he died. 4 words, no context, no follow-up. They'll know before us. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd turned it over for weeks. They'll know before us. I'd thought about weather, about markets, about the strange collective sense animals seem to have before a storm. But sitting at the table with those 14 extension pages spread out around me, the frost hardening the ground outside, and the geese quieter than usual since the temperature had dropped, I thought maybe I finally understood what he meant. He had watched them for a season before any emergence happened. He'd cataloged what they did in the weeks before, feeding patterns, movement, some quality of alertness he described only as different. He'd never published it, never told anyone as far as I could find. He'd just kept watching, and then he'd bought more. And then he'd bought more again, until he had a number that made sense, only if you believed what he believed about what they could do. I called the extension office again the following morning. The woman I'd spoken to before wasn't in, so I asked to speak to whoever handled pest management records. I was transferred twice, and then reached a man who had a flat, unhurried voice that reminded me of my grandfather's. I told him I was looking at the emergence table in the document his office had sent me. I asked him if the 39-year figure was typical for this species cycle in this region. There was a pause on his end. "Where exactly is your property?" he asked. I told him. "Harlan County. The northeastern parcel, off Route 7, about 4 miles past the grain elevator." The pause that followed was longer than the first one. "How many acres are you running?" he asked. 61 tillable, I said. "Another 12 in pasture and woodlot," he asked me to hold. I heard a chair move, a drawer open, the sound of papers. Not a keyboard, actual papers, the kind that had been filed in a physical cabinet for a long time. When he came back, his voice had shifted in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not alarmed, more like careful. "The emergence table we sent you," he said, "that's a county-wide composite. We pulled it from 3 monitoring stations. But your specific parcel, that northeastern section off Route 7, that's in a microhabitat zone we've been tracking separately since 2019. I sat down at the kitchen table without meaning to. "Separately," I said. "The soil temperature gradient there runs about 2 degrees warmer than the county average on that side of the ridge. Something to do with how the terrain sits. That affects the developmental timeline underground." He paused again. "For your zone specifically, the emergence window we're looking at is narrower and earlier." "How much earlier?" "Potentially 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the composite table." I looked at the calendar on the wall. My grandmother had hung it there in what I estimated was the mid-1990s based on the farm supply logo and the phone number format printed at the bottom, and I had never replaced it because it had the planting dates written in her hand. The squares for the current month still had her penciled notes in them, transferred each year by whoever was paying attention. Notes about soil temps, about frost, about when to watch. "So when," I said. He read me a window. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope, the same way I'd been writing things down since I got here. The mortgage figures, the vet bills, the feed invoices. The same handwriting, the same blue pen, the same kitchen table. The dates he gave me were 31 days away at the far end, 18 days at the near end. I thanked him and hung up. Outside, through the window above the sink, I could see the geese moving along the eastern fence line in a loose formation that had no obvious logic to it. They weren't feeding. They weren't heading toward the pond. They were just moving in that particular way they sometimes did in the late afternoon, not hurried, not random, something in between. The old man in the notebook had a word for it that I'd underlined twice. He called it prospecting. Looking at ground they hadn't looked at yet, or looking again at ground they already knew. I stood at the window for a long time. 18 days was not very long if you were wrong. It was exactly long enough if you were right. I called the crop insurance adjuster that same afternoon. He was a man I'd spoken to twice before, once about the alfalfa, and once about a hail event in late May that had turned out to be too minor to file on. He remembered my name. He also remembered the farm's policy number faster than I did, which told me he'd been waiting for me to call. I told him what I was seeing. I described the defoliation pattern along the south field, not uniform, not the irregular scatter of drought stress, but moving, progressing, the way something moves when it has direction and appetite. I told him about the egg casings. I told him about the geese. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough to make me think I'd lost the signal. "You're telling me your geese are working the perimeter?" he said. "Since about 10 days ago," I said, before I could see anything myself. Another pause. "I need to come out there," he said. He came the next morning. He was a heavier man than I'd pictured from his voice, mid-50s, wearing a company polo that was too warm for the weather and carrying a clipboard with a clear plastic overlay that made the papers underneath look official in a way I'd learned to distrust slightly. He walked the south field with me for 40 minutes without saying much. He crouched twice. He took photographs with a camera that was older than his phone. He looked at the geese from a distance and then looked at me. "How many do you have?" he said. 981, I said. He wrote something down. "All working like this?" "They rotate," I said. "Different sections at different times." "I don't direct them." He looked at the field again. The geese were visible at the far end, moving in that prospecting formation I'd been watching for weeks. He was quiet long enough that a cloud shadow passed across us and moved on. "There's a threshold," he said finally. "For the policy to activate, I need to document active infestation at a level that meets the coverage criteria What you have right now, he paused, looking at his clipboard, then back at the field, is borderline. It could go either way in the next week. I know, I said. He looked at me more carefully then. Not the way the banker had looked at me. Not the way the man from the Agricultural Extension Office had looked at me. Something else. Like he was recalibrating something. You've got containment working, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I think so, I said. But I need it documented either way. Before the window closes. He nodded slowly. He wrote something else on the clipboard. I'll be back Thursday, he said. Thursday came with fog. It sat low over the east field until nearly 10, the kind that doesn't burn off so much as dissolve, leaving everything it touched with a damp film. The fence posts, the tops of my boots, the windshield of the adjuster's truck when it pulled in at 9:47. I had been up since 5. I hadn't slept past 5 since the Geese arrived. He brought someone with him this time, a woman older, wearing the same beige vest with the same company logo on the chest. She carried a camera with a lens that seemed excessive for a farm field. Neither of them said much. When they got out, I walked them to the gate. The Geese had moved to the south section overnight. I hadn't directed that. I never directed it. They'd been working some kind of pattern I couldn't fully decode, favoring the low ground in the early morning, moving to higher ground by afternoon, always heaviest at the edges, where the neighboring unsprayed field bordered mine. The border was where the pressure was worst. The Geese seemed to know that. The woman with the camera went ahead without being invited. She walked along the fence line, stopping, crouching, photographing the soil. The adjuster followed me at a distance. She's the entomologist, he said. She'll do the formal documentation. I nodded. We watched her work for a while. She moved the way someone moves when they're looking for something specific, not general. Pulling back a clump of grass at the field's edge, bending close, moving 12 feet, pulling back another. After about 20 minutes, she stood up and walked back to us. She said something to him in a low voice, showing him the camera's screen. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at the field. You said you haven't applied any chemical treatment, he said to me. No. And the only intervention is the geese. The geese and the rotation schedule. I moved the flock between sections on a 3-day cycle. The timing came from a notebook. I paused. I hadn't meant to say that last part. My grandfather kept records from an earlier outbreak. He looked at me. The entomologist looked at me. How old are the records? She asked. 1957, I said. She glanced at her colleague. Something passed between them that I wasn't meant to see but did. The infestation along the south border qualifies, she said. That meets threshold. She looked back at the field. But the interior section, she stopped. The interior sections are clean, I said. Yes, she said. They are. The adjuster uncapped his pen. He had a different form now, a different clipboard. He set it on the hood of the truck and began to fill it out. And the sound of his pen was the only sound for a while beside the distant movement of the geese. The adjuster wrote for a long time. I watched his pen move across the form without trying to read it. The entomologist had walked back to the edge of the field and was crouching now, her fingers moving through the grass at the boundary between the treated section and the south border. She was photographing something small. Her colleague stood apart with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the geese work the far end of the third rotation zone. I had stopped feeling anything particular. That's the only way I can describe it. The weeks of watching, the sleepless stretch when the south border first showed signs, the morning I drove to the co-op and stood in the parking lot, unable to go inside. Because I didn't want to hear what anyone would say, all of it had flattened into something quiet and neutral, like ground after rain. The adjuster looked up. I'll need the acreage breakdown by section. Do you have that documented? I have it in the rotation log. I can get it from the house. I'll need a copy. I'll make one. He nodded and went back to writing. A goose at the edge of the nearest section lifted its head and looked at me, then lowered it again. The entomologist came back from the field boundary. She had a small glass vial in her hand with something in it I couldn't see clearly. She held it up toward the light for a moment, then tucked it into the chest pocket of her vest. She looked at me. The 3-day rotation, she said. That was in the notebook. Yes, the original outbreak, the one your grandfather documented. What year did it break? The first entry is July 14th, 1957. He noted the first signs along the same border, the south. She was quiet for a moment. Same field? Same field. She looked back toward the interior sections, where the grass was still green, where the geese moved in their slow, patient lines. How long did his outbreak last? He got it under control by late August, 6 weeks week, and this one started July 9th. She did the arithmetic herself. I watched her do it. She didn't say anything when she finished. She just looked at the field again with an expression I didn't know how to read. Not quite surprise, not quite admiration. Something between the two that didn't have a clean name. The adjuster finished writing. He pulled the form from the clipboard and held it out to me. You'll want to keep a copy of this for your records. The assessment process takes 10 to 14 business days, but given the documentation you have, he paused, it may move faster. I took the form. The paper was warm from where it had rested against the metal hood of the truck. The adjuster left around 4:30. I stood in the driveway and watched his truck until the dust settled back onto the gravel, and then I stood there a little longer, holding the form against my chest. The geese were moving back toward the eastern pasture in a loose procession, the way they always did in the late afternoon, unhurried, purposeful in that particular way of theirs that I had spent months learning to read. I had counted them that morning, 89. 2 had died in the 3rd week of July, 1 from the heat, and 1 from a cause I still haven't identified. 89 geese, walking in a direction they had chosen themselves, along a boundary line they had mapped without my help. I went inside and put the adjuster's form on the kitchen table next to the ledger. The ledger stayed open on that page for the rest of the evening. July 14th, 1957. His handwriting was careful and close. The kind of handwriting that takes patience, and I thought about him sitting at this same table, maybe with the same radio on, writing down what he saw so that someone, he probably didn't know who, would have it later. He didn't know me. I never met him. He died 11 years before I was born, but he sat here and wrote it down anyway, with enough specificity that 67 years later I was able to hand it to a man in a button-down shirt and watch him go quiet. That is not a small thing. The outbreak peaked on July 31st and began to recede the 1st week of August. The adjuster called on the 8th to tell me the assessment had been expedited. He used the word compelling to describe the documentation. I wrote it in my own notebook under the date because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to hear someone use that word about something my grandfather had done and I had known to look for. The south field will need reseeding in the spring. The geese won't be enough to reverse what the locusts did in 6 weeks, and I'm not under any illusion that they will be. But the interior sections are intact, and the eastern pasture came through without damage, and the flock is healthy and loud in that particular way. That means they are healthy, that low, constant sound that visitors still find unsettling, and I have learned to find the opposite of that. If you've ever been handed something old and heavy and been told it's a burden, if you've ever been the youngest person in the room and felt the room adjust its expectations downward, I want you to know that the answer is almost never in the room. It's in the drawer nobody opened. It's in the building nobody unlocked. It's in the handwriting of someone who knew this land before you did, and trusted that you'd know what to do with what they left. Subscribe if you're still looking. Leave your story in the comments. I read everyone.